Okay, this Koine lesson is about attribution. Of course, attribute, you notice the word tribute. And this is what we do. We tribute and give glory to. Word glory means in verb to glorify would be to opine. To opine. And of course, favorably. And even a right opinion exists, a word in the Bible, right opinion, and we're told to give tribute, make attribution. Anyway, all this is for us to understand in just somewhat of a, this is just a little helpful for the frustration a lot of people hear. There's texts in the Bible that refer to us, use the word us, for example. Us. And I'll use the one in Ephesians 1:4 that some say is the most controversial, which I suppose that's how you continue to generate the economy of agitation rather than the ministry of reconciliation. But us, when Paul wrote and said he chose us, which is the word spoke, it has the idea of speak, has the word speak in it. And it has out from, spoke us, out from. Well, this is where some people begin to debate here, and I'll show you some things here. They'll say out from, let's say all mankind. And they don't really think about what they're saying because that's really not in the text. But where do we have chosen at? We know Jesus said that he called sinners not righteous. So of the two class of people at any given time, there's the righteous. And these would have been the self at the time he spoke that. So he didn't call them, so he called the sinners, and then he said there were many of them, many called. So there's the sinners, many called. And it says then few of these are chosen. Chosen. And of course that one in Ephesians was not even to the church. It was, but it mentioned the saints in Ephesus. That is, that conjunction I told you that is often translated that is, to show that the writer is continuing to explain himself and attribute to his original statement. So he said to the saints in Ephesus, and then he put that is faithful ones. That kind of thinned out the crowd, didn't it? It's funny, and that's a heavy word there. That is faithful ones, and that's the ones in Ephesus. So when he says us, if someone today, for example, whether it be from an Arminian construct or a Calvin tradition or whatever, attributes this to themselves, whatever it is that permits that or compels them to do that is what occurred first. I mean, unless you believe the Bible, you'll never attribute this to yourself. You'll never consider this speaking to you until you first believe the gospel. Until after you believe the gospel, then you're born again. Then you're continually believing. The letter wasn't written, it's not one of the gospels. It wasn't written in order that you might believe. This is so they might know the purpose for which they were chosen, and to understand why. You'll hear a lot of people today that argue about who it is, for example. Who. So, of course, if you're a Pharisee, you'd say, well, it's my group. Or if you're a Sadducee, you'd say the Sadducees. If you were Protestant, you'd say the Protestant. Or you're Catholic, you'd say whatever. Or you would say Jew or Gentile. You just go on down the list. This never ends. It was never the purpose for God choosing anyone. So if you ever run into someone who's giving a lot of energy to deciding who it is that God's chosen rather than the purpose for which we have been chosen, which is very specific in that text, then you'll know at least they're not one of God's elect. That is, they're not one elected according to the purpose explained and elucidated in Ephesians. In Ephesians, you'd have to have a relationship with the assembly, and that's one of the purposes there. That spiritual temple, that house dome, that spiritual temple, you'd have to grow up to the full measure of the stature of Christ. Don't run into a lot of people like that. You'd have to be that sun place, it says, that we were predestined to, which is not heaven, it's the sun place. That's a position of maturity. The prodigal son, he came home, had the right attitude, willing to make restitution, acknowledge his own unworthiness to be called a son, and then the father could put him into the son place, that is a master over the house. So if you're not in the assembly and you're not part of that spiritual house of God, that temple there, and you're not growing to the full measure of the stature of Christ, you're certainly not coming to the son place. Now, indeed, you might have heard the gospel and believed it. You might have been born from above and be believing, but you might have been so distracted by the empty discussions around the word elect or chosen that you never even are engaged in this. Now, that could list several other things, but this big mysterious book, for example, in Ephesians, leads into things like being imitators of Paul, like a child imitating. It says don't find ourselves in an intoxicated mind state, which is an abandonment, he said. Not to find ourselves supposing this is taking place without being husbands who love our wives like Christ loved the church. And don't suppose that we're part of this assembly, this spiritual temple, growing to the full measure of the stature of Christ and maturing into this son place, or exercising the mastery of the house as a full-grown son who's been entrusted to that and should have grown to that. If you're a woman, not submitting yourself to your husband like the church submits itself to Christ. And don't suppose any of this idea of election applies to you, or the predestination to the son place, and all these other wonderful things, if you're a child who's not obedient to his parents in the Lord. For that's what the whole book is talking about as far as our personal relationships as head, Christ head of the man, God the head of the husband, husband head of the wife, the parents oversee the children, children are subjected to the parents, fathers are not supposed to rage alongside. So you probably hear a lot about, the silly emptiness of who's that us referring to. Well, if a person doesn't believe, what are we saying they don't believe? Well, they don't believe that us refers to them. They don't believe that book speaks to them. Atheists will tell you that the God to whom the Bible is, or from whom the Bible was personally written, that he doesn't even exist. They make no attribution to God. So if you say, well, how is it that people argue all the time about this? Well, it's back to what we said about the purpose of John 3:16. People argue, does world mean everyone or not? And then they'll take where Jesus gave his life for his sheep or died for the sins of his people. And then if you don't read John 20:31, for the purpose of those accounts was so that a person might come to the point to believe, then you just keeps the banter going. And again, this is a matter of attribution. And it's really not that difficult. It's just being honest and also being intelligent, being educated. Christians, theologians, I should say, historically in the past, were the ones who developed calculus, and without which mathematics that we know today wouldn't exist. Without that, science that now negates theology wouldn't even exist today. So the language of science came from we who are believers, we who have a mind to attribute what we observe which is the same scientific method, same scientific procedures. We have been practicing true science for centuries before this Johnny-come-lately militant atheism that's taking place. But the attribution is what it's called when a person believes. Now, there's such a thing as a black box. You see it when some of you may not remember, but there was a time where people could actually, perform math or arithmetic in their head and things like that. Well, now these calculators would be a good example of a black box, or a computer where all the work's done in here. So what you do is you have, like for the example, the gospel and what I just said, the message. Let's say we have a message, our gospel, and then somewhere in here we have the hearer is in here, and on the other side we have a newborn person born from above. And Paul said that he told the Corinthian church, he said he generated them through the gospel. So in this case, Paul would be the agent. The gospel would be the instrument through which, literally it's like a conduit, through which he said he generated those believers in Corinth. So people sometimes underestimate the gospel and the power of running to people and say, well, there's nothing I can do about my kids or my family or my wife or the world or whatever, and yet we have the most powerful message apparently in the universe. It says the power of God unto salvation is the gospel, and it's to everyone who believes it. And Paul said he generated them through it, through the gospel. So where people come up with purposes for arguing or actually paralyzing people who aren't growing, if you say you're one of God's elect, but you're not growing into that son place, because today I'm told statistics say that people are, just because they are Christians, they aren't really in a developmental process or engaging. So a lot of these arguments are just ridiculous. If anyone 2,000 years from the time of the letter in Ephesus was written, or to Ephesus was written by Paul, can attribute to themselves the word as part of that us to whom it was written, whatever allows for that allows for anyone to believe the gospel, and then of course attribute to them and to God the glory, and to themselves the benefits of that. And I don't know what it is, except I see a lot of people exasperated by trying to reduce John 3:16 to, well, it refers to everyone, or trying to reduce it to, no, it just refers to a select few. Neither of those are the purpose for which it was written. Here Jesus died for his sheep, laid down his life. I don't know that it'd be a gospel if we heard he laid down his life for the wolves. It'd certainly frighten we, the sheep. But to hear that someone had demonstrated that kind of love is exactly what compels someone. And I know people have really had a lot of fun with their imaginary purposes, or restricting attribution, or that black box, as I was saying, pulling things out of that box. But according to the Bible, that reconciliation is to be changed according to God. And the Bible says he's holy, that we are to be holy. It even says in 1 John, he knows all things. It also says we know all things. And of course, the things that we would know would be the things, of course, that God has provided us. And then, of course, what he knows is what he's provided himself. The difference is, for example, once we're reconciled, and that's something we are commanded and that was written to a church in Corinth, to be reconciled to God, is then we begin to posit in all these areas where we once negated. And it's a quantifiable. So we move from those who negate to those who posit. And so we posit God as holy. That's one of His attributes. We say He's just, righteous. We say He's omni. And that all three of those, the omniscience, we recognize His omniscience, His omnipotence, power, and then His presence. We recognize all that. We posit that. But now that's after reconciliation. And you can see where some people don't develop into this because they're too busy getting tripped up in here with these false... well, give me an explanation of how does He know everything. And then you'll see someone give the cutest illustrations of, well, God knows what we're going to eat for breakfast 10 weeks from now. But they don't give the ugly side of it by suggesting that God may know of some horrific thing that will take place in our lives and just leave us going on merrily along without informing us. Of course, I can see why the bloggers don't write things like that. They would like to keep people coming to their churches and bringing their children and believing that God's alive and living and concerned and cares about us, and that we can call upon Him for the intervention and the safety and the futures of our children, and that we're not just sitting here waiting to find out the hard way in some Russian roulette, I suppose. But after reconciliation, we posit. And notice that verb posit's where the verb positive comes from. And you'll hear people say they're positive, but they avoid the magnificent attributes of this just, holy, righteous God who calls men, who convicts the whole world of our sins, according to John 16. Jesus said it. We're all convicts, but He's just in doing that. He's holy for condemning sin. He's just for considering it a crime. Yes, He knows even more than all things. His intelligence is infinite. His power is not capable of being quantified. His presence is anywhere and everywhere. So, again, we make attribution and we praise and we laud Him. But there's really no valid, there's really nothing valid about what the arguments are today anyway. They're all made from finite conjecture, speculating on from the viewpoint of the infinite God. So, I mean, if you want to talk to your friends and have a good time, a few laughs, and take turns saying, well, I'll be the Calvinist for a while and you be the Arminian, it's fun, it's good fellowship, but you'll come back to Koine and realize it's time to grow up, go forward, and continue to develop and be a better dad, a better husband, a better brother, a better child, a more obedient child, a wife, be more accustomed to following the direction of her husband, showing forth the very thing which God sought to establish in the garden, which has been opposed from day one. So that's plenty. Just know that if someone ever points at a text in the Bible and they say that refers to me, what they're actually saying is they believe and attribute that to themselves. The text wasn't written for the banter that we have today that says, oh, it says us, so it's exclusive. Well, if it's exclusive, then it was only to the church in Ephesus, actually the saints in Ephesus, actually that is the faithful ones in Ephesus. So how you open that up from that would be where you'd want to start explaining why it's not something for us today. Anyway, that was enough, plenty to think about.